Let's talk about relations. Relations is what you think it would be. It's about the relationship between different things. So we've done a lot of this actually. If you think about it, these are, as you know, equations. They're also formulas, which are equations used to show something specific. These equations are actually used to show the relationship between different variables. So here's the relationship between area and length and width. This is the relationship between the circumference of a circle and its diameter. And there are countless other formulas we could use to show different relationships. Well, there's a few more methods that we haven't talked about quite yet for how to determine the relationships between different variables. So let's look at one that perhaps we don't have a formula for. We're going to call it a hypothesis. An hypothesis is an educated guess. It's a guess at what's the relationship between two or more variables. Let's make a bit of a guess. So young drivers. Well, you may or may not agree with this, and even if you're not driving it, you may have an opinion. But some people have a hypothesis that young drivers are more likely to drive dangerously. And in this particular sentence, I am guessing at the relationship between a couple of variables. The variables include the age of a driver and how safely a driver drives. Now this may sound like something that's pretty hard to put into a formula, but if you're an insurance company, you might actually have a formula for this. You might have a way of figuring out how likely it is that someone will drive dangerously, and one of the things you might put in that formula is the age of the driver. But that's just a hypothesis. I haven't proven anything. I've just guessed it, and I have no way necessarily of knowing that's true until I go out and I test that. Well, when I test that, some people call that an experiment, right? I can set up an experiment with drivers of different ages, and I can test to see how dangerously they drive. So an experiment is where I'm going to test the relationship between variables. Now perhaps I don't have the ability to go out and test this. It's going to be too expensive for me. I don't have access to a bunch of drivers, or maybe I just don't have the right to go out on the roads and test this sort of thing. So what I might do is go and ask else for their information on drivers and draw my own conclusions. So if I run my own experiment, the information that I come up with is called primary data. It's primary data because I created it, or it's my experiment that produced it. Now if I use somebody else's data, I use someone else's experiment. Perhaps someone else did an experiment having to do with the drivers, and they weren't really interested in the age of the drivers or anything like that, but it just so happens that they recorded the age of the drivers. I could probably use some of their information to come up with my own conclusion. So if I use someone else's experiment, I'm going to call that secondary data. So for instance, perhaps the government has a record of all of the speeding tickets it's ever given out, and it just so happens they have a record of the age of the people that got those tickets. Well, that's their own primary data, but now if I use it to draw my own conclusions about the age of drivers and how safe they can drive, then that is now secondary data. I'm using it for my own purposes, and I'm probably using it to test my own hypothesis. So hypothesis is an educated guess, and an experiment is where I actually set up a way to test the relationship between variables. I'm actually going to test my guess. see whether I'm right. The key thing about an experiment is that I'm willing to find out that I'm wrong. I'm willing to find out my hypothesis is not right. This is why, and we're almost through with this, but this is why it's pretty important for us to be able to find the opposite of a hypothesis. So young drivers are more likely to drive dangerously. Well, the opposite of that hypothesis would be likely to drive dangerously. Or perhaps the opposite is they are not more likely to drive dangerously. And I have to be willing to accept that if I do an experiment, that might be what happens, that my hypothesis could be totally wrong. In fact, the hypothesis could be correct. And that's it for now.